Inside a stone war room, a massive map of Europe covered the wall. Red and blue pins marked victories, defeats, and front lines. Almost everything had changed since the war began, except one place. The British Isles. German generals stood in silence, staring at the channel. 3 years of war, 3 years of bombing, 3 years of isolation. And Britain was still standing. One of the senior generals slowly removed his glasses and spoke in a low voice. They should have surrendered back in 1940. Another officer folded his arms and replied, "Any other country would have asked for peace by now." In 1940, they had been certain. France collapsed in weeks, Belgium in days. The Netherlands almost overnight. Britain, however, was different. No army left on the continent. Cities burning under air raids, ports under constant threat, fuel and food stretched thin. Yet, no surrender came. A general with combat scars across his face finally broke the silence. "We destroyed their cities, but we failed to destroy their will." The room fell quiet again. For the first time, doubt entered their calculations. This war would not be short, and perhaps for the first time they realized they had misunderstood their enemy. 1941 to 1942. The reports kept coming in, and none of them said what Berlin wanted to hear. British cities were damaged, but still functioning. Factories rebuilt faster than expected. Airfields repaired almost overnight. A German general scribbled angrily in the margin of a briefing paper. They absorb punishment like no other nation. Private conversations grew sharper. In closed meetings away from speeches and propaganda, frustration replaced confidence. One commander slammed his fist on the table and said, "We are bleeding them," yet they refuse to collapse. Another officer replied quietly, "Because they are no longer fighting to win quickly, they are fighting to endure." That realization unsettled them. Britain had no allies on the continent for years, no second front, no quick relief. And yet, British convoys kept sailing. British pilots kept flying. British radios kept broadcasting defiance into occupied Europe. A Luftwaffe commander admitted in his diary, "We underestimated their patience. They are willing to suffer longer than we are." By late 1942, the tone had changed completely. No one spoke of British surrender anymore. Instead, a new fear emerged, that Britain was not merely surviving, but waiting for strength, waiting for allies, waiting for the moment to strike back. One general closed his notebook and said quietly, "A nation that survives 3 years alone does not break easily." And for the first time, the question in the room was no longer when Britain would fall, but what would happen when it returned. The tone inside German headquarters had changed. Maps were still on the walls, pins were still moved, but the confidence was gone. Now the British Isles were no longer marked as a future collapse, they were marked as a threat. A senior general pointed at the English coast and said quietly, "They are not waiting to surrender anymore." No one disagreed. British air raids were growing bolder, naval power stretched across the Atlantic, and everywhere German intelligence looked, Britain was preparing, not defending. One officer whispered what many had begun to fear. A country that survives alone for 3 years learns how to fight back. In private letters, generals admitted what they would never say publicly. "We believed time was on our side, but time strengthened them instead." Another diary entry, dated late 1943, read, "Britain did not break under isolation, it hardened." The idea of invasion now dominated conversations. Not if it would happen, but when. A planning officer studied weather charts, landing zones, and supply routes. After a long silence, he said, "They have patience, they have experience, and now they have allies." That was the moment many German commanders realized the truth. Their greatest mistake was not failing to defeat Britain. Their greatest mistake was believing Britain would ever quit. One general closed the meeting with a sentence no one forgot: "A nation that stands alone for 3 years does not come back weak." And as the room emptied, one thought lingered in every mind. Britain was no longer surviving. Britain was preparing. Late 1943, early 1944. The question was no longer if Britain would strike. It was where. Inside German headquarters, the maps changed again. Not arrows pointing toward Britain, but arrows pointing outward from it. Normandy, the Low Countries, the Channel Coast. A general traced the shoreline slowly with his finger and said, "They have studied this coast for years." No one laughed. No one argued. British air power now crossed the skies almost at will. Ports were filled with ships, supplies, and men. Radio traffic increased. Deception plans confused intelligence officers. One staff officer admitted quietly, "They learned patience while standing alone. Now they are using it against us." In private briefings, German commanders spoke with brutal honesty. Britain did not rush. Britain waited. Britain prepared. Another diary entry from early 1944 read, "We once believed isolation would weaken them. Instead, it gave them clarity." The weight of the mistake became impossible to ignore. Every delay in 1940, every failed air campaign, every assumption that Britain would negotiate, all of it had led here. A senior general closed a late-night meeting and said the words no one wanted to hear. "They are not coming to test us, they are coming to finish this." Silence filled the room, because everyone knew the truth. A nation that survives alone for 3 years does not attack recklessly. It attacks with certainty. And as the lights dimmed and the maps were rolled up, one final realization settled in. Britain had never been waiting to quit. Britain had been waiting to return. June 1944. The reports arrived before dawn. At first, they were confused, fragmented, contradictory. Landings, airborne troops, ships beyond the horizon. Then, the truth became impossible to deny. A German officer burst into the room and said only one word: "Normandy." Silence followed. Not shock, but recognition. One general slowly closed his eyes and said, "So, this is it." For years, they had watched Britain refuse to fall. For years, they had mistaken endurance for weakness. For years, they believed isolation would force surrender. Instead, it had forged something dangerous. A staff officer stared at the map and whispered, "They waited longer than we expected, and they came back stronger than we imagined." In diaries written after the landings, German generals finally admitted the truth. Britain never fought to survive alone forever. Britain fought to buy time. Another entry read, "Our greatest error was not failing to invade. It was believing Britain would ever stop resisting." By the end of that day, no one spoke of British collapse anymore. The conversation had shifted to containment, to delay, to damage control. One exhausted general summed it up with a sentence that echoed through the halls: "A nation that stood alone for 3 years does not return to ask permission." As the maps were updated and the front lines redrawn, the final realization settled in. Britain had never been broken. Britain had been patient. And patience, they finally understood, had won the war long before the first soldiers stepped onto the beach. Late 1944. The tone had changed completely. There were no grand speeches anymore, no promises of reversal, only quiet conversations and written reflections. In private letters and post-war recollections, German generals spoke differently than they ever had during the war. One wrote, "We always measured strength in divisions and tanks. Britain measured it in time." Another admitted, "They fought alone not because they wanted to, but because they were willing to." Looking back, many agreed on one thing. Britain's greatest weapon was not its air force, not its navy, not even its allies. It was refusal. Refusal to negotiate, refusal to panic, refusal to believe defeat was inevitable. A former commander reflected, "Any nation can fight when it is winning. Very few can fight when they are alone, and still believe in return." By the end of the war, the lesson was clear to them. Britain had not survived by chance. It had survived by choice. One final line, written years later, summed it all up. The war was decided the moment Britain chose not to quit, when quitting would have been easier. And in that quiet realization, stripped of uniforms and maps, many German generals finally understood. A nation that stands alone and refuses to surrender has already won something no enemy can take away. Years later, when the war was over and the uniforms were gone, the lesson remained. German generals compared notes, read old diaries, revisited decisions that could never be undone, and again they returned to the same moment. Not a battle, not a landing, not a turning point on a map, but a choice. The choice Britain made when it stood alone and refused to quit. One former commander summarized it plainly. We believed pressure would force surrender. Instead, it forged resolve. Another wrote, Britain did not survive because it was stronger at the start. It survived because it was willing to wait. Looking back, they understood what they had missed. Strength is not always visible. Endurance is not always loud. And patience can be more decisive than force. The war did not turn when Britain gained allies. It turned earlier, when Britain chose to stand alone and never stopped believing it would return. That was the lesson they carried with them. Not written in orders, not marked on maps, but remembered in silence. A nation that refuses to quit changes the outcome long before victory is visible. In the end, the answer was simple. Britain did not survive because it was untouched. It was bombed. Isolated, outnumbered. Britain survived because quitting was never accepted as an option. German generals searched for complex explanations after the war: strategy, resources, timing. But the truth was quieter than that. One of them wrote, years later, "We waited for Britain to give up. They waited for the war to come back to us." That was the difference. While others fell quickly, Britain chose endurance. While others negotiated, Britain refused. While others hoped for relief, Britain prepared alone. 3 years of standing by itself did not weaken the country. It trained it. And when the moment finally came, Britain did not rush. It did not hesitate. It returned with certainty. That is what the German generals finally understood, too late. The war was not lost when the beaches were taken. It was lost when Britain decided years earlier, we will not quit. And once that decision was made, everything else was only a matter of time.